Okay, let's talk about your 5 dates in history exercise. This was just an exercise, like I said before, in getting the conversation started. And what I want to try to look at in the context of our peacemaking class is how the church historically has responded to violence, either eschewed violence or used violence to accomplish just ends. And so, what I wanted to do with the historical dates forum and discussion is just get that conversation started. Like I said, this is an art, it's not a science. There's really not any particular right answer, but what I want to do is kind of skip a rock across the lake of history a bit and hit on some of the major epochs or eras, some of the major dates, and then how that shapes and influences the story that we inherit about Christianity in the West and how that impacts Christianity in other areas of the world as well. And so this is going to be mostly a Western story. It's not a complete story because there's things that get left out of this story that are important to consider, but it is a story that we inherit a lot as you interact with people who are not persons of faith and even people who are persons of faith. This story impacts how they perceive Christianity. And so the first date that I want to hit, and that you can follow along in the PDF that I've made available in last week's course shell. But the first date that I want to hit is the Jewish Revolution in 66 through 70 CE. And why that's important, and some of you use that date in your forum and discussion, mention that date, and why that's important is in the early days of Christianity, the Christian movement, followers of Jesus, did not participate in the Jewish Revolution. And what that meant was that Christianity and Judaism begins to split. But Christianity is particularly a peace movement at this time. And they're trying to ask the question, how do we love our enemies? And the answer to that question is we do not fight them. We don't kill them. Up until 70 AD, the primary audience for the gospel is a Jewish audience, where Jesus is the Messiah. But as things begin to split between Judaism and Christianity, because the Christians did not participate in the revolution, is the primary audience becomes a Gentile audience because Christians get spread throughout the Roman Empire. So if the primary audience beforehand was a Jewish audience, the primary audience after the revolution becomes a Gentile audience. So Jesus is a Messiah to a Jewish audience, and Jesus is Lord to a Gentile audience. So the Jewish Revolution impacts how Christianity is perceived, and in the early days, it's primarily perceived as a peace movement, a nonviolent movement. That changes in the 4th century when Constantine adopts Christianity or something, not necessarily as the official religion of Rome, but it soon becomes that. So you have the conversion of Constantine. You have him trying to settle theological disputes, not necessarily for theology's sake, but for the peace of the Roman Empire. And what you get is gospel and empire together. So where the gospel goes, it needs to be protected by the empire. And where the empire goes, Christians need to protect it because that's protecting the gospel. So we're born into the faith, and not it's not a voluntary decision. And we protect and expand the gospel by protecting and expanding the empire. So we use the state's power for kingdom purposes. And this still has an impact on us today. We still have a narrative, even in America, about America being a Christian nation. And so where America goes, the gospel goes. And if you have any experience of being missionaries overseas, which many of you do, you know that people understand America, at least self-perception, as a Christian nation. And so in this era, Augustine begins to develop just war theory, because how do we love our enemies? It's the same question, but how do we love our enemies? We fight them according to just war principles, or in just means. And what you get out of this later is the Crusades and the Inquisition. these are just expressions of wedding the gospel and the empire together. Um, so you have the 4th century adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire as a significant shift in our perception on how to use violence and what to do with violence to obtain just ends. The third major shift is the Reformation, when Martin Luther posts the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. This begins the modern Western plurality. And what this means is, instead of the authority and ubiquity of the Western Catholic Church, you have a sola scriptura. That is, people are their own interpreters, right? There's no authoritative interpretation. And what that does is, when the state is wedded with the church and there's no authoritative interpretation, then the state adopts different interpretations and they go to battle over those. And one of the major battles during that time, or the major wars that impacts the Western world, is the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. And this is a war between Catholics and Protestants in Europe, and it decimates Europe. And it begins to motivate the leading thinkers, many of whom were Christians of the day, to look to ground reason and morality outside of conflicting interpretations of Scripture. So they look to something distinctly human to ground morality and rationality in. And what you get there is a good example, and I have a picture of a Descartes in here, but Descartes is heavily influenced by the 30 Years' War, and so he publishes his Meditations as a way to search for a foundation for rationality and morality outside of conflicting interpretations of Scripture. That's where you get his famous, I think, therefore I am. He's trying to ground rationality in something distinctly human. So you have Descartes with reason, you have Newton with science, you have democracy with Locke, all developing during the modern period after the Reformation. And all three are Christians in some sense, but they're motivated to move outside of the conflict that different interpretations of Scripture that are wedded along with state power are producing, the conflict that they're producing in society. And you begin to get a narrative that with democracy, the exponential advances of science, the hope of education and rationality, you get an optimism that society is progressing. And that society is progressing without necessarily a grounding in Scripture. And during that time, you also have colonialism. If we're progressing as a Western world, what happens is that progress should be exported. Also, not only should the progress be exported, but national resources should be gained through conquest and colonization. So you get here you get the conflation of the gospel and conquest. So Western Christianity becomes associated with the oppression of native peoples. What you also get during this time is in the 1800s in America is a civil war. Mark Noll wrote a book called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, because both sides on the Civil War argued from the Scripture. And what Noll says in that book is that because both sides argued from the Scriptures to justify either abolitionist or slavery, what you get is moving the Bible further and further to the margins of the conversation of culture. That Christianity is associated with conflict, and therefore we need something different. What you get at the late 19th century, the late 1800s, on the heels of the Civil War, is also 4 distinct challenges to the Christian faith. You have Darwin, who biologically challenges the origin stories of Genesis. You have Marx, who economically challenges religion as the opiate of the masses, that it keeps people in their place and keeps the powerful in power. You have Freud with a psychological challenge that God is just a projection of some of our human needs. It actually is not God does not objectively exist, but it's just our psychological projections. And then you get German higher criticism, that the scriptures don't account for or can't withstand the challenges of literary criticism, historical criticism, and scientific criticism. So to culminate in that, what you get is Nietzsche saying that God is dead. If these things are true, if we don't need God as a background framework for reason and morality, then what we get is power and a move to power. So these challenges are coming in the wake of scientific, rational, and democratic progress, and you get basically a secular promise. If you give reason, democracy, and science enough time, we will solve the world's problems. The next major area then is what happens with World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression. It ushers in postmodernity, and these two major wars stop the notion of we're making progress, because you have technology that's going to benefit humankind, or that was the hope, and this is the case with technology today, is it has both positive and negative uses. And how can we use our technology for something like the experiments that went on during the Holocaust and the genocide of peoples? And how can we use our technology to bomb two cities with the atomic bomb? So what happens is, with postmodernity, after World War II, we begin to deconstruct the Enlightenment project, the modern project. And I want to say something a little something about postmodernity. There's three levels of postmodernity. One is that there's no objective reality. That reality does not exist. It's just a projection of our thoughts in our mind. The second is that the objective reality exists. We just can't get to it. That there's something out there, but we're limited in our ability to get to it. And then the third level of postmodernity is that it's sometimes difficult to get to objective reality because of our predispositions and our loyalties. And what we want to do in this class is this third level of postmodernity is we can embrace this as Christians because of the doctrine of finiteness and fallenness. That we're finite, we're limited in our knowledge, and we're fallen, so we tend to bend the universe in our own direction. And so we can embrace this this level of postmodernity in the sense of, yes, we have a difficult time sometimes in getting to reality, but there's an opportunity to do that if we can just move in the direction of challenging our assumptions and some of our basic assumptions and moving our frameworks outward. And so what you get at the end of postmodernity, which I would say we're moving out of postmodernity because you can only deconstruct for so long. Basically, the deconstructive project has run its course, and what you get is two things. One is you get meaning and significance when your story is part of a bigger story, and I think you see that with people, the recent research on people's affinity for spirituality. They don't want to be associated with religion because of this Western story. Religion is associated with conflict. But they do want something spiritual, that there's something out there that's greater than ourselves, and we can find meaning and significance by placing our story in a bigger story. So we get that meaning and significance from a bigger story. And there are some things that we want to say are objectively morally wrong. Some small examples of that are just slavery, the Holocaust, apartheid, and some of the genocides that are happening. So let me summarize really quickly how this story comes to bear on us. Christianity is a familiar alternative among many possible spiritual alternatives to bring meaning and purpose to one's personal, private life. But it is viewed with skepticism because of religious conflict. The perception is that it has been tried and found inadequate, and we've moved past that. People are spiritual now, but not religious, because they don't want religion, because every time you bring religion out into public, it causes conflict or it causes violence. A great example of that is 9/11. It's not a particularly Christian association, but most people associated 9/11 with Islam, radical Islam, and but that's the bigger picture of religious violence in the world. So what we want to say is that the promise of secularism went unfulfilled. The deconstructive project of postmodernity has run its course, and we might actually have a new opportunity to preach the gospel a second time, learning from our history. And the questions for our course will be, how do we use our power? How are we going to use our power? And then the second one, especially for peacemaking, is how will we respond to conflict and violence? How do we follow in the way and the truth of Jesus in our call to be people of peace, especially in a world confused about power and filled with conflict? So again, the 5 important dates, if I can really summarize quickly, is the Jewish Revolution in 66 through 70 AD or CE, which the Christian movement was associated with a peace movement and nonviolence. The 4th century, where we get the beginnings of just war theory. Plato and Aristotle developed that, but you get the baptism of that just war theory and the development of it as Constantine begins to adopt Christianity into the religious atmosphere of the Roman Empire. The third, and what you get with that is the Crusades and the Inquisitions later on. The third major date is the Reformation and the 30 Years' War. And that causes plurality and conflict associated with religion and the move towards getting outside of conflicting interpretations of Scripture to ground reason and morality in something distinctly human. And you get colonialism, imperialism, and you get the Civil War during this time as justifications of using religion to justify violence. Then you get the World War I and World War II that basically ends the modern period and ushers in postmodernity. And then I talked about the consequences of postmodernity, how we can view that, and then how we're moving out of postmodernity, because you can only deconstruct for so long. You have to put things back together into a bigger story. And so then we have post-secularism after postmodernity. And I would say we're on the verge or moving into post-secularism, where the secular promise has gone unfulfilled. So people want spirituality, they want meaning, they want mystery in their lives, but they don't want the religious conflict. And what I want to say is we have an opportunity, especially in this peacemaking class, to talk about how can we preach the gospel a second time. How can we understand the creative space between pacifism on one hand and nonviolence on one hand, and just war theory and using violence to accomplish just ends on the other other hand, in this creative space in between that we're calling just peacemaking. And so that's what we want to talk about throughout this course, is this creative space and how to overcome this narrative of violence associated with religion, and especially associated with Christianity in our course.